The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine grit that coated the soul. It worked its way into the leather of Corbin's boots, into the lines around his eyes, and into the silence that was his only true companion. He stood by the saloon's warped hitching post, a ghost in the brutal afternoon sun, watching the town of Redemption breathe its foul, whiskey-soaked breath. It was a place that had forgotten its name's meaning, if it ever knew it. Men with hollowed-out eyes and quick hands drifted through its single street, their laughter like the scrape of rock on bone. Corbin wanted only tobacco and salt, the simple necessities that would allow him to retreat back to the wind-scoured ridges where a man's sins could be worn away by solitude. He felt a shove from behind, the prelude to trouble. 3 railmen, broad and baked red by the sun, grinned at him. Their leader, a man with a stained beard and cruel, small eyes, pushed something forward. It was a person, small and lost in a dirty shift, a girl whose black hair was matted with grime. She stumbled, and he saw she was Chinese, one of the countless souls brought over to blast through mountains and lay track, treated as less than cattle. "Got a present for you, wolf eyes," the bearded man sneered. "Figured you was lonely up in them hills." Their laughter was a raw, ugly thing. They shoved her again, hard. She fell to her knees in the dust, a bundle of rags and terror. And then, she did something that stopped the world. Her hand, thin and trembling, shot out and latched onto the cuff of his trousers. Her grip was desperate, a drowning man's grasp. She clung to his leg, her face pressed into the dusty leather, a choked sound escaping her throat. The men's laughter hitched, turning to confused mockery. They expected him to kick her away, to treat the gift with the contempt they intended. But Corbin did not move. He only looked down at the dark head of hair, at the small hand wrapped around his ankle, and felt the anchor of her terror in a way that silenced the entire world. He felt the weight of their stare, hot and expectant. The men of Redemption were vultures, waiting for the first sign of weakness to tear a man apart. They saw the woman clinging to his leg not as a person, but as a test, a provocation wrapped in a cruel joke. Corbin's gaze lifted slowly from the woman to the bearded man. His own eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no anger, no fear, only a profound and weary stillness. The world had done its best to burn the humanity out of him, leaving behind a hard shell of quiet survival. But the desperate grip on his ankle was a spark in the kindling of a long-dead fire. He could feel her trembling through the thick leather of his boot, a frantic, bird-like tremor of pure fear. He thought of the traps he set in the high mountains, the snap of steel, the caught animal's final, terrified struggle. He had always made those ends quick, a small mercy in a merciless world. He looked at the grinning faces, teeth stained with tobacco, and saw the trappers, not the trapped. His own past was a gallery of violence, a landscape of necessary cruelties, but this felt different. This was sport. His hand, which had been resting near the worn handle of his pistol, dropped to his side. He didn't need a weapon for this. His voice, when it came, was rusted from disuse, a low rasp that cut through their fading laughter. "Gone," the bearded man's grin faltered. "What's that?" "We're giving you a gift." Corbin's eyes did not waver. He repeated the single word, infusing it with all the finality of a closing grave. "Gone." Attention coiled in the dusty street. The men shifted, their bravado curdling into menace. But they saw something in Corbin's stillness, a capacity for violence that was deeper and colder than their own boisterous cruelty. They hesitated, then the bearded man spat on the ground. "Keep the gutter trash, then." "Suits you." They turned and swaggered away, their parting jeers failing to mask their retreat. The silence that fell was heavier than their noise. The street was empty again, save for him and the woman still clutching his leg as if he were the last solid thing on earth. The journey away from Redemption was a long, unspooling silence. He did not speak to her, did not touch her. After the men had gone, he had waited, standing like a statue in the oppressive heat until her grip on his leg finally slackened. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with a terror that had not yet been replaced by any other emotion. He simply turned and started walking. After a long moment, he heard the soft, shuffling sounds of her following. The sun beat down, turning the cracked earth into a skillet. He walked with a long, ground-eating stride born of years spent in the wilderness, but he found himself subconsciously slowing his pace, listening for the faint sounds of her bare feet on the sharp rock and parched soil. He never looked back, but he was aware of her as a constant presence, a small shadow trailing his own. The landscape was as stark and unforgiving as his own life, weathered rock, twisted juniper trees, and the vast, indifferent sky. It was a place that stripped you down to your essence. He wondered what her essence was, beyond the terror he had first seen. He saw the world through her imagined eyes, the menacing shapes of the rocks, the hawk circling high overhead not as a thing of beauty but as another predator in a world of them. Once, he stopped by a thin trickle of a stream to fill his canteen. He drank, then set it on a rock and walked away a dozen paces, turning his back to give her space. He heard her hesitant approach, the sound of her drinking, desperate and quick. When he turned back, she was standing where he had left her, the canteen on the rock between them, a silent offering. He picked it up without acknowledgement and continued on. The distance she kept was precise, never too close to be a threat, never too far to be left behind. It was the careful calculus of survival, and he, a lifelong survivor, recognized it immediately. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with the things they did not know about each other, a chasm of language and experience, bridged only by the simple, shared act of putting one foot in front of the other, moving toward an unknown destination. His cabin was less a home and more a shelter, a small fortress of hewn logs tucked into a stony fold of the mountains, almost invisible against the grey rock. It was a place built for solitude, with one room, one window, and a heavy door. When they arrived, dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the western peaks. He pushed the door open and entered without a word, leaving her hesitating on the threshold. The inside smelled of pine smoke, leather, and dried herbs. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and dark. A simple cot, a table, 2 chairs, the spare furniture of a life stripped of all excess. He dropped his pack on the floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He saw her silhouette in the doorway, a fragile shape against the fading light, poised for flight. She was watching him, her entire being focused on his every movement, trying to read the intent behind the gesture. He moved to the hearth, striking a match. The flame bloomed, and he touched it to the waiting kindling. Fire caught, and a warm, flickering light pushed back the encroaching shadows. The light caught the side of her face as she finally stepped inside, revealing the sharp line of her cheekbone and the dark, deep pool of her eye. She was a ghost given form by the firelight. He took a heavy wool blanket from a chest at the foot of his cot and placed it on the floor in the corner farthest from him, a clear demarcation of territory. He didn't look at her as he did it. Then he moved to the table, unwrapping a piece of dried venison and a hard biscuit from his pack. He sliced the jerky with his knife, the blade moving with practiced efficiency. He ate his portion standing, then placed the rest on the table, along with a biscuit and a dipper of water. He moved to the window, staring out at the star-dusted darkness, his back to her, granting her the privacy of a predator deliberately looking away from its prey. For a long time, there was no sound but the crackle of the fire. Then, he heard the whisper of cloth, the softest scrape of the tin dipper on the wooden table. The silence that followed was one of sustenance, a fragile truce declared in the shared act of breaking bread. Days bled into one another, each marked by the rising and setting of the sun, each governed by an unspoken rhythm. A new kind of silence began to grow between them, different from the tense, fearful quiet of the journey. This silence was shaped by routine, by the parallel paths of their existence in the small cabin. Corbin would rise before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and go out to check his traps or hunt. He would return to find the fire stoked, the single room swept clean with a makeshift broom of bundled twigs, and a pail of fresh water drawn from the nearby spring. He never asked her to do these things. One day, she simply began. She moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency that he started to admire. She had a way of mending, her small hands working a needle and thread through his torn shirt with a precision that was almost beautiful. He would sit at the table, cleaning his rifle or sharpening his knife, and he would watch her from the corner of his eye. He noticed the way the tension in her shoulders had begun to ease, the way she no longer flinched if he moved too suddenly. She had claimed a small space as her own, a patch of sun by the window where she'd sit, and a tiny garden she started near the door, coaxing green shoots from the hard-packed earth. He didn't know the names of the plants, but he saw how she tended them with a gentle reverence. One afternoon, he came back from the woods and laid a brace of rabbits on the stoop. He went to sharpen his skinning knife. When he returned, she was already there, the knife in her hand, working with a speed and skill that startled him. Her hands were not just for mending and gardening. They knew work. They knew survival. She glanced up and saw him watching, her hands momentarily stilling. He gave a short, single nod of approval. She looked down and resumed her work, but he saw a faint flush creep up her neck. The silence was no longer a wall, but the very air they breathed, a medium through which understanding could pass without the clumsiness of words. The mountain was a place of sudden, brutal change. One moment, the sky was a placid blue, the next, the world was a fury of wind and rain. A storm blew in from the north, a great, dark beast that clawed at the little cabin, shrieking through the cracks in the logs. For 2 days, they were trapped inside, the world reduced to the 4 walls of their shelter and the roaring chaos outside. The fire was their only sun, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. The confinement should have been a pressure cooker, amplifying the tension between them, but it did the opposite. It created a small, shared island in a sea of elemental rage. They were 2 souls adrift, and the cabin was their raft. On the second day, he was securing a loose shutter against the wind when the storm ripped it from his grasp, slamming it against his side and sending a long, wicked splinter of wood deep into his forearm. He cursed, a sharp, guttural sound, stumbling back inside with blood welling dark and fast from the wound. He slumped into a chair, trying to pull the splinter out with his other hand, his fingers clumsy and slick with blood. He was so focused on the task, on the searing pain, that he didn't notice her approach until she was standing before him. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes wide. He expected to see fear, the old, familiar terror of his violence and his pain. But he saw something else there, a sharp, focused concern that cut through his haze of agony. She gestured toward the wound, a questioning look in her eyes. He hesitated for only a second before nodding, his breath hissing through his teeth. She moved quickly, fetching a clean cloth and the dipper of water. Her touch, when it came, was shockingly gentle. She cleaned the area around the splinter, her fingers probing the edges of the wound with a clinical lack of hesitation. She looked at him, a silent question. He gritted his teeth and gave another nod. With a steady hand, she grasped the end of the splinter and pulled. The pain was a hot, white flash, and he grunted, but it was clean, a release. She immediately pressed the cloth to the wound, applying pressure, her small frame leaning over him. It was the first time they had touched since that first day in the dust of redemption, and this time, it was not an act of desperation, but an act of care. After she bound his arm, the storm outside seemed to lose its fury. The wind shriek softened to a mournful moan, and the rain settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The atmosphere inside the cabin had changed irrevocably. The shared vulnerability, the simple, profound act of tending a wound, had dismantled a wall between them he hadn't even realized was still standing. The silence that fell was no longer about caution or the absence of a common language, it was a comfortable, breathing thing. It was the quiet of a shared space, a mutual existence that no longer required justification or vigilance. He sat by the fire, flexing his fingers to keep his bandaged arm from stiffening, watching her. She sat across the hearth, mending the shirt he'd been wearing, the needle flashing in the firelight. There was a peace in the small, domestic sounds, the crackle of the logs, the whisper of thread through cloth, the soft sigh of the wind outside. Their gazes met across the flickering space between them. For the first time, she did not look away. Her eyes, dark and clear, held his for a long moment, and in them, he saw not fear, not gratitude, but a simple, profound recognition. She saw him. And he, in turn, saw her, not as a victim or a burden, but as the woman who had pulled a splinter from his arm, who coaxed life from barren soil, who had survived. Later, he took a small block of pine from his kindling box and his knife. He began to carve, the blade peeling away thin, fragrant curls of wood. He didn't know what he was making, but his hands knew the work. It was something to do, a way to process the shift that had occurred. She watched him, her own hands now still in her lap. The rhythm of his carving, her quiet observation, it was a conversation without words, an acknowledgement of the fragile trust that had finally taken root in the stony ground of their solitude. The peace was a fragile thing, as delicate as a skim of ice on the spring creek. He knew it couldn't last. The world outside their mountain sanctuary had not forgotten them. He saw the sign one morning, a fresh hoof print where none should be, a snapped twig on the game trail that led toward his cabin. They had been found. The tension returned instantly, a cold knot in his stomach. He didn't have to explain. When he came back inside, his face was a mask of grim resolve, his movements sharp and purposeful. He took his rifle from its pegs on the wall and began methodically cleaning it. She saw him, and all the newfound softness in her posture vanished. She became as still and watchful as she had been on that first day, but this time, her watchfulness was not directed at him, but at the world beyond the door. She understood. The threat that was coming was not his, but theirs. He worked in silence, loading the rifle, checking his pistol. He felt her eyes on him. This was the part of him she had not yet seen, the man he had been before, the reason the men in Redemption called him Wolf Eyes. He was a creature of violence when pushed, and he was being pushed. He finished his preparations and looked at her. She stood by the hearth, a small, resolute figure in the dim light. He crossed the room and took the skinning knife from its sheath on the wall. It was a utilitarian tool, but it was sharp and deadly. He held it out to her, handle first. Her eyes widened as she looked from the blade to his face. It was not a command. It was an offering. He was not telling her to fight, he was giving her the means to, if she so chose. He was acknowledging that her survival was in her own hands, as well as his. She hesitated for only a second, then her small hand closed around the wooden handle. Her grip was firm, steady. She was no longer just a survivor of past cruelties, she was ready to be a combatant for her future. They came at midday, 3 of them, including the bearded man. Their voices were loud and ugly, tearing through the mountain quiet like a jagged blade. "We've come for what's ours, trapper?" The shout was a violation, a profane intrusion into the sanctuary they had built. Corbin stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stood before the door, an immovable object, his body a shield for the life within. "She's not yours," he said, his voice flat and cold, carrying easily in the clear air. The bearded man laughed. "We gave her to you." "She's property." He and his companions began to spread out, a crude attempt to flank him. Corbin didn't move, his eyes tracking the leader. "You made a mistake," Corbin said. "Now leave or what?" the man sneered, raising his own rifle. The world exploded in a concussion of sound and smoke. Corbin fired first, his shot not aimed to kill but to warn, splintering the stock of the bearded man's rifle and sending him staggering back with a cry of shock and pain. The other 2 men, startled into action, returned fire. The fight was a brutal, clumsy thing, devoid of honor or glory. It was about survival. Corbin moved with a cold, deadly economy, using the corner of the cabin as cover. A bullet ripped through the sleeve of his shirt. He fired back, and one of the men went down, clutching his leg. Inside, Mai did not cower. She pressed herself against the wall, knife in hand, listening to the cacophony of shouts and gunfire. She peered through a small crack between the logs. She saw the 3rd man, seeing his chance, break from cover and rush the cabin's open door. Corbin was occupied, pinned down. There was no time to think. As the man lunged through the doorway, she put all of her weight into the heavy wooden door, slamming it shut. The man screamed as the solid oak crushed his arm, his pistol clattering to the floor. The sound, the momentary distraction, was all Corbin needed. He stepped out from cover and the fight was over. The aftermath was a profound, ringing silence. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The intruders were gone, one nursing a broken arm, the other a wounded leg, their bravado shattered. They would not be back. Corbin stood for a long moment, the rifle heavy in his hands, watching them retreat down the mountain. The violence had left him feeling hollow, an old and weary sensation. He turned and went back inside. The cabin felt different, the air charged. Mai stood by the door, the knife still clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright, fierce. They looked at each other, the defender of the threshold and the guardian of the hearth. No words were needed to explain what they had done, what they had become. They were no longer a man and his ward, or a protector and his charge. They were partners. They had fought for their small space in the world, together. Later, after he had cleaned his wounds and she had barred the door, they sat by the fire. The silence that settled between them was the deepest and most peaceful yet. It was a silence born not of necessity, but of choice. It was the quiet of shared victory, of a future earned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of pine he had been carving. He had finished it during the quiet moments of the past few days. He held it out to her. It was a bird, its wings half spread, poised for flight. A symbol of the freedom they had just secured. She took it from his calloused palm, her fingers brushing his. She studied the small, wooden object, her thumb tracing the lines of the feathers. Then, she looked up at him, and for the first time, a true smile touched her lips. It was a small, fragile, beautiful thing, like new grass pushing through hard stone. It was not an ending, but in the quiet warmth of the firelight, it felt like the beginning of everything.